It's a great honor to rise from the dead and address you today. This is going to be a very difficult talk because sometimes I'm going to have to speak in the third person about myself, but I will do my best. This is an outline of the talk. First, a little history, and that's really why we're here today, to talk about history and how all this weaves together to what you're doing today. Some of the connections are incredibly strong. I'll give you a little biography of myself, but I'll talk about, most importantly, the water supply for Jersey City, New Jersey, and how they came to be the first place in the United States to have continuous chlorination for disinfection purposes. And I'll talk about that sterilization plant at Boonton Reservoir, which I designed. And then finally, what does all this mean? What is the legacy of the chlorine revolution? So, George Warren Fuller's role in the first continuous use of chlorine in a drinking water supply is largely unknown. Everyone knows that Fuller designed and supervised the construction of the first modern filtration plant in Little Falls, New Jersey. But I'm going to talk about how an unlikely team of a physician and an engineer collaborated to revolutionize public health. And then finally talk about the legacy and what this means, how two giants affected everything that we do. As you've heard, the 1800s were a transition period from the miasma theory to the germ theory of disease. But even in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, waterborne disease and death were still facts of life, despite all the work of Pasteur, Lister, Koch, and Dr. John Snow. The germ theory of disease was not fully accepted in the United States. It says here, even as late as 1910, one author puts the general public acceptance of the germ theory of disease at 1920, if you can imagine that. Rivers became more polluted in the US as urbanization and industrialization exploded. There was a huge amount of immigration to this country. The Industrial Revolution took off in a major way. Cities became extremely crowded with filth and disease, and there was tremendous death. There was a public health movement, but it was focused primarily on removing the filth, removing the garbage in the streets, the animal excrement, the smells, truly based upon the miasma theory. At the time, everyone knew that if you had an upland source of supply, that you were safe. If there was no sewage going into your water, everything was fine. But they wanted to construct sewers, just as you heard about London. They wanted to construct sewers to get that smelly stuff away and get it into the nearest river or lake as soon as possible. At the same time, they were building centralized water systems. And so they created a highly efficient means of conveying contaminated water to populations in the cities of the United States. This is a very unique situation in the 1890s and early 1900s. England, the UK, actually did build slow sand filtration plants, and slow sand filters were also prevalent in the continent, but the US, because it was so expensive, they didn't build the filtration plants, and so people died. And they created what I call the sewer pipe, water pipe death spiral, where you have people taking water out at the top of a river, but then putting sewage in, and then taking water out, sewage in, water out, et cetera, and contaminating the supply with, as we now know, disease-causing organisms. But these were accepted as facts of life. People dying in incredible numbers from typhoid fever primarily. Cholera was pretty much contained by a variety of different techniques of the public health movement, but typhoid fever killed tens of thousands every year. I was born on December 21st, 1868, shortly after the Civil War ended, in Franklin, Massachusetts. I went to MIT and graduated in 1890. My professor was William Sedgwick, who was a tremendous influence on my life and really created one of the first public health, schools of public health in the country, although it wasn't even called that at the time. After I graduated, I went to Berlin and studied filtration with the great Karl Piefke. I took a course in bacteriology at the Institute of Hygiene in Berlin. And this is important because bacteriology was just beginning to be formed as a science and a practice. And the only way that you could get any training was to actually go to Europe, go to Berlin, go to the place where it was actually being developed and taught, which was in Dr. Koch's facility, in the hygiene facility. When I graduated, I had a tremendous opportunity to work at the Lawrence Experiment Station in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Sedgwick, George Whipple, Alan Hazen, these were some of my comrades and people that I went to school with, and my professor, Dr. Sedgwick. All of them worked at the experiment station, primarily focusing on ways to treat sewage with actual filters, including sand filters, and ultimately by raising the different levels of filtration and looking at drinking water treatment as well, we were able, I was able to develop the approach to what was called mechanical filtration and called, of course, rapid sand filtration or rapid gravity filters today. I was actually put in charge of the station at Lawrence, Massachusetts when I was 24 years old. After the work in Lawrence, I had the opportunity to go to Louisville, Kentucky, and conduct a study for 2 years, which was one of the first studies, really comprehensive studies on drinking water filtration. And I'll step out of my role as Fuller now and tell you that this is an amazing piece of work. You can actually find this entire study online in Google Books. It's out of copyright, so you can download it. And I really urge you to do it. When you read through it, it's just astonishing what they were doing in the 1890s, which had not been done before. He was breaking new ground every year. He also went to Cincinnati for 2 years and conducted additional studies which led to one of the first modern filtration plants in Cincinnati in the early 1900s. George Warren Fuller joined Rudolph Herring, who was another prominent sanitary engineer, in 1901, and for 36 years he consulted for hundreds of cities. And that's not an exaggeration. I don't mean he spent a day here or there in hundreds of cities. I mean that he and his company, very small company, built the water and sewage treatment plants for hundreds of cities. It's quite an amazing record. And 1902 is the key date because it was the year that he built the first modern granular media filtration plant in Little Falls, New Jersey. There is still a treatment plant on that site. You can still see vestiges of George Warren Fuller's treatment plant and the layout for gravity filtration from that plant. His first use of reinforced concrete and common wall construction, which many of you, of course, know about, occurred at the Little Falls plant. Just imagine that. This had never been done before. No one had even thought about it, but common wall construction from this point on became the basis of all designs of water treatment plants and indeed wastewater plants. Well, my professional career was indeed storied. My personal life was a mess. I was married 4 times, lucky enough to have 3 sons. Not too many people know this, but my second wife, rather my third wife, was my second wife? No, it was my third wife. We divorced, unfortunately, and I married her divorced sister.